So welcome, I'm Cindy Griffin. I am one of 4 homeopaths at Homeopathy Center of Houston. I'm going to put my PowerPoint up here on the screen, and I am going to, let's get that on here. I'm going to take myself out of the screen so I won't be a distraction to everyone. But I want to welcome you. We're going to talk a little bit about PANDAS, anxiety, tics, and Tourette syndrome. We're going to touch on a lot of things. So let's just get started. As I said, I'm Cindy Griffin. I am one of 4 homeopaths at Homeopathy Center of Houston. We are a Houston-based practice, but our clients are literally all around the world. We have 10 to 20 years each of experience with our method and autism, and PANDAS as a part of autism, as well as PANDAS, anxiety, tic disorders, and so forth, being a part of our practice for many years, far too many, unfortunately, because these have become so prevalent. We are busy with a lot of these sorts of problems, and there are a lot of environmental reasons for this, and we'll get into some of those as well. Our practice has over 60 years of experience with homeopathy, and our practice turned 15 this month. And 2 of us, my business partner Lyndall, who is also manning some of the chat questions, and myself, as well as 3 of our office staffers, are parents of special needs children. Lyndall's and mine are recovered. One of our office staffs, 2 of our office staff have recovered kids from autism. My son actually had some anxiety issues himself. Lyndall's son had a tic disorder, had Tourette syndrome. So when we speak to you, we're speaking not only as practitioners, but also as parents. So we've been down the road as parents as well as practitioners. So what are some of the symptoms that are wrapped up in what's now called PANDAS or PANS? As homeopaths, we don't worry so much about a diagnostic name. In fact, we don't worry about it at all. We worry about, do they have symptoms? What are the symptoms? And here we go. So, all right, Bill asked, I'm going to ask that you hold most of your questions till I finish most of this, but regarding the seriousness of the recovered kids, the 2 kids that I'm speaking about as far as Lyndall's and mine, my son had high-functioning autism or Asperger's. Lyndall's son had very serious Tourette syndrome, to the point that the tics would keep them awake, keep him awake and keep everybody awake for hours and hours. But our practice actually has almost 200 children who came to us with a full-blown autism disorder, diagnosis, either autism or PDD-NOS, and almost 200, 196 is the latest count, I believe, maybe 197 now, have fully recovered from autism. So we're not talking about kids that have just a few little, ADD and that kind of thing. We're talking kids who had full-blown autism diagnoses and lost them. And a lot of those kids had a co-diagnosis of PANDAS. Most of them have anxiety disorders, and virtually all of it, it doesn't really matter what it's called. All of these things are wrapped up often as a part of the autism spectrum. But I am going to focus on the PANDAS aspect, not only as a part of autism, but also as its own disorder, even with people who don't have an autism spectrum disorder. Sometimes it comes on later in life. We are working with adults whose kids have been exposed to strep, brought it home to mom. and mom would go into an anxiety disorder. So we're going to cover a lot of ground. So I want to jump into this. We're going to talk, yes, vaccine injury is a part of the autism spectrum, and it also seems to be a part of PANDAS. So, okay, Mary Lou, I don't know what's going on. I think everybody can hear me but you, but we will definitely send out a replay link. So watch for that. It'll come in an e-letter, an email newsletter. So, okay, so if you or your child have some of these symptoms, obsessions, compulsions, repetitive talk, or perseverative talk, they get stuck on one particular subject, and that's all they'll talk about, and you can't easily redirect them. Maybe they have anxiety. Maybe they just cry uncontrollably at times, and you have absolutely no idea what's going on. Occasionally, they can switch back and forth between crying or laughter. Now, that can be related to some other issues. They may have sensitivities, sensory problems, sounds, lighting, textures, such as oral textures, foods that they simply cannot, they'll gag because they cannot stand the texture. Sometimes they can't stand clothing, or the tags are very irritating. And these are just some of the issues. There are so many other symptoms that can be involved in PANDAS. PANDAS is officially known as pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders associated with streptococcus. PANS is the new DSM, DSM-5, I almost said 4. The DSM-5 renamed it as PANS, or Pediatric Acute Onset Neuropsychiatric Syndrome. And part of that is because there are so many different pathogens that can also be tied up with these sort of symptoms. We have found that the overarching problem appears to be strep related, but there can be other pathogens. A lot of times the laughter can actually be from candida or fungal dysbiosis. So there are a lot of different triggers and a lot of different things that can be involved in it. But again, as I said, strep seems to be the overarching criminal in the cases. It doesn't matter to us what it's called, and it doesn't really matter to us which pathogen is the problem. Vaccines very definitely can be a part of the issue. And one of the things that we worry about as homeopaths is going to be not so much, does your child have a diagnosis? We don't care. If you don't have an official diagnosis, it doesn't matter. We look at the current symptoms, and everybody's symptoms are individually differentiated. Each person is going to show different manifestations, and so we go by what is specific to you or your child's individual case. As I said, in some cases, it may be an exposure to strep. In some cases, it may be strep followed by an antibiotic. Sometimes the onset is after an antibiotic for something completely unrelated to strep. It could be for ear infections, throat infections, or it could be, you know, an infected injury or something like that. But afterwards, something gets triggered that causes the OCD or the tics or things like that. It can happen after a vaccine, so it can also be vaccine injury. We have seen just an observation. There has been a big uptick in anxiety disorders, PANDAS, whatever you may want to call it, since the introduction of the PCV13, which was about 6 to 7 years ago. And about 1.5 years, 2 years after that, suddenly you saw this huge interest, swell of interest in anxiety disorders, tic disorders, and PANDAS. They've been going on for a long time, but they seem to have definitely taken an uptick since we went from the PCV7, which had 7 different strains of strep pneumoniae, to the PCV13, which has 13 different strains. So there's something additional in the environment that's happening. And the pneumonia vaccines can shed just like the flu vaccines. So we look at the history, but sometimes you can have an exposure and you don't even realize where it came from in the environment. So we do get a very detailed individual history because nobody's history is the same, and therefore nobody is going to share the same, necessarily the same triggers or the same exact onset or even the factors that we're going to need to address. But when it is something that is a sudden onset of anxiety, a sudden onset of worry, a sudden onset of some sort of OCD, hand washing has become the typical one, but we find that there can be obsessions with playing with light switches, or obsessions with having to touch a certain thing going through a room, or can't go out the door without going back and touching something, repeatedly. So all this kind of thing, there are things in the history that may give clues, but sometimes we don't even know what it may have been that actually kicked things off. So again, we don't need a diagnostic term. We go by the particular symptoms. And then our job is to try to heal and relieve what you or your child is experiencing in the here and now, whether it's mental or emotional. There may be some physical symptoms that are involved. Elizabeth, I noticed you said that your daughter has been diagnosed with strep up to 7 times a year. It is entirely possible that in her case, it's a more physical manifestation, but she may have actual chronic strep. Antibiotics don't actually kill strep. They just peel away kind of the outside layer. And unfortunately, it was proven by a lady named Lyda Matman that antibiotics don't kill bacteria. It actually strips out the outside wall, or in the case of some of the newer ones, it changes the DNA slightly, but it doesn't actually kill it. It can actually make them worse. And now, once you strip away that cell wall of a bacteria, it's now going to act more like a virus, and microbiology has proven that it can then piggyback its DNA onto an actual virus such as herpes. And because herpes in particular has an affinity for nerve tissue, it can now be pulled into the nervous system and directly into the brain. There are mouse studies that are showing that strep can actually find its way along nerve pathways from the sinuses into the brain, completely bypassing the blood-brain barrier. Aluminum in the brain will literally call the macrophages to come into the brain, and then they get stuck there, and then basically the blood-brain barrier begins to break down. So strep is finding its way into frontiers where it has never been before. It's finding its way into the brain. And there's a lot of science about that. You can look it up on Google Scholar and find a lot of information if you just kind of keep digging a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper. So it is manifesting in a lot of different ways in a lot of different people. And we look at the specifics of how it's manifested. We look at the mental, the emotional. Are they crying a lot? Is it something that is just going on in the environment? Do they have tics that are maybe preceded it, or sometimes they continue even when the more mental and emotional manifestations and behavioral manifestations come out? We look at things that make them better or worse, such as, are they better at a certain time of day? Are they worse in the morning, worse at night? Better in the morning, better at night, maybe sometime during the week. We have kids that are worse during the week and get better on the weekend because of things they're eating in school when they trade lunches with other kids. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Temperature can actually make things better and worse. Dietary triggers, environmental triggers, or situational triggers. Just a child who has been very compliant, suddenly cannot stand to be told no. So all of these things can be what we look at. Now, homeopathy is completely non-invasive, and we have seen kids recover without surgeries, without antibiotics. We use homeopathy exclusively. We can suggest a few supplements if they're in order, but sequential homeopathy is what we use to work back through that individual history. We look at past illnesses. Have they got a history of sore throats or ear infections? We look at past traumas. Was there some emotional trauma that perhaps pushed the immune system over the edge, and now strep is taking over that was already present in the system? Have they had drugs? Did this come on after an antibiotic, which again maybe stripped away that cell wall of the strep and allowed it to go into the brain? What we just want to know, we focus on what occurred just before the onset of the symptoms, especially in the case of sudden onset tics or sudden onset anxiety disorders or OCD. So all of this is what we take into account. We focus on healing. We don't focus on rerouting things. We don't chemically attack. We do not attack the pathogens. We do not attack anything chemically. We just use homeopathic remedies that allow the immune system to do the work. So we harness the immune system. And the immune system is really what then acts on everything: mind, body, and emotions and behaviors. Homeopathy is a very natural, holistic, or whole body approach for healing. Autism, and in this case, PANDAS, as well as all kinds of other things. I mean, we work with allergies, we work with hangnails, we work with menopausal symptoms. But our focus today is both autism and PANDAS, but the PANDAS aspect. And the way we do this is through detoxification and through use of the healing and health systems that are part of the body. We can use homeopathic remedies to support these. So we have seen kids recover just by doing minor detox from a lot of things. It's amazing how you get the bad stuff out, which is what homeopathy does. And then you can actually see the body start to heal itself. Homeopathy is completely pharmaceutical free. It is legally called a drug because we have our own homeopathic pharmacopoeia with the FDA. So we are FDA regulated. The manufacture of homeopathic products is regulated in this country. And even in other countries, the FDA sets certain guidelines for anything that is going to come into this country as a homeopathic medicine. But it is completely non-toxic because the remedies are made through dilution. And that dilution factor is what allows us to use virtually anything that can be either ground up and then diluted, or simply dilutes in alcohol. It can dissolve and be diluted by alcohol or water. So plants, animals, elements such as minerals, all that sort of thing. All of these can actually be a part of the remedies that we can use, that we have at our fingertips. And it causes a very safe detoxification. And that, oops, got ahead of myself. The detoxification is really everything that homeopathy does. It's all about helping the body rebalance itself. We don't throw in chemicals that are going to go in and try to take things out. The remedies simply signal the body to use its own innate healing and detoxification devices and systems in order to clean it up, clean itself up, clean up the cells, and then once they're cleared out, to help support the healing process. So it's completely non-invasive. There are no needles, there's no surgeries. Most everything is either going to be liquid drops or little pellets. It works by facilitating the body's own detoxification and self-healing processes and built-in systems. It doesn't directly attack viruses or bacteria or even heavy metals. It's not a chelation. Chelation sends a chemical in, and a certain amount of it grabs onto metals and then washes them out, but only a small percentage actually comes back out. So now you've got the residue of the chelation in there. A lot of times we actually have to clear out some of the chelation. Because then if those chelation drugs stay in the system, the homeopathy cannot efficiently withdraw the heavy metals that it's still hanging on to but didn't eliminate. So we just support the system to naturally and systematically restore its own equilibrium, and then health follows. Sequential homeopathy is the framework of what we do. We use homeopathic remedies in particular orders based on the history of the person in order to detoxify and heal from traumas and the damage, one event at a time in reverse chronological order, literally peeling back the layers of the onion, but the layers tend to be in chronological order. We start by where you are now, and then you back away. So it can be very deeply healing because we not only are using remedies that will give relief of current symptoms and problems, but over time, about a month at a time, we peel the layers of the actual causational factors, and that is how we can get such permanent gains. So some of the symptoms that we have been able to help that are related to PANDAS or anxiety or tic disorders are some of the sensory sensitivities to light, textures, both orally as well as touch. Some kids can't stand to be touched, and we actually can help. Sounds, a lot of kids are sound sensitive. You see them covering their ears. The busyness in the environment, a lot of ADD kids and ADHD kids, part of that may be related to the very pathogens we're talking about. Anxiety, fears, dilated pupils. When we see dilated pupils, that's actually one of the very typical symptoms of streptococcus is the pupils are dilated. I did a consult fairly recently with a relatively new client, and they were told that, oh, we did a blood test and there's no strep. And I said, are the pupils dilated? And the mom said, oh, yeah, have been for years. I went, there's strep there. Now we can see urinary problems, daytime accidents sometimes. Bedwetting is a stellar symptom, especially in a child who maybe never had that problem before. If we're working with autism and a child who was toilet trained suddenly has bedwetting, we know we've got a layer coming up that's related to PANDAS and to strep. You can see emotional swings, overly happy or sad. We have helped every one of these problems. Depression can be a part of PANDAS, and we have seen so many people we've worked with depression who've been able to handle it while we're working through what led to it. And PANDAS can actually have depression as a part of it. We've had people say that hitting oneself in the face or head is actually comforting. Well, again, that's a PANDAS sign. So we know that we can help these things. We've seen it done with kids with autism. Yes, we work with GI issues, and sometimes those will be a part of autism. And I would like to refer you to some of our earlier webinars that will talk a lot about the GI issues. So we do have a number of videos and so forth on our Facebook page and in our webinar list that will talk about that. And we have helped with obsessions, with certain activities, certain subjects of interest, repetitive talk, hand washing, sorting, and lining up objects. We have seen people completely lose these symptoms. The fight or flight, we see this with a lot of kids with autism, where they live in fight or flight mode, and if given a chance, they can dart out a door and into traffic. So that's something we take very seriously because of the safety concerns. We've seen eating disorders that have improved. Kids who eat too much or stuff too much in their mouth. Non-autistic people who overeat or have food addictions. Or anorexia, the opposite, where they are so obsessed with what they're eating and what their weight is and their body fat. That can actually be a huge part of the PANDAS aspect. And irrational fears, fears that with food that it might be contaminated or that they might choke on it. All of these things are things that we have seen and we have worked with, and we find that that we get relief with these kids and with adults. Separation anxiety can be huge. Irritability, where it's the Jekyll and Hyde, where 1 minute they're falling apart, they're so angry, or they're having a, falling down, beats themselves to a bloody pulp on the floor, or they strike out at others, and then all of a sudden they're just so remorseful. Handwriting problems often go with strep. Behavioral regressions, sleep issues, hyperactivity, distractibility, so ADD and that kind of thing. Schoolwork regressions or grade regressions with kids that were straight A students and suddenly their grades just fall off and they're worrying about their grades and they're so worried they can't do their homework. Developmental regressions, tics, robotic movements, choreiform movements, all of these things can be related to PANDAS, and they can also be related to, in some cases, a part of autism as well. So I want to talk about some cases. The first case I wanted to bring up because this is actually a mom, a neurotypical, non-autistic, not even ADD as far as I know, mother, has had 4 kids, and over a period of just a few weeks started having fears, panic attacks, and it just kept getting worse and worse and worse, worrying about her husband and her kids if they left the house, that something was going to happen to them, that they would be harmed or they would be killed. Just gripping fears all day until she had everybody back under her wings at home. She was concerned also that she was having a crisis of trust in God, which then, of course, compounded her anxiety, because then she started worrying, am I losing my faith? And she constantly, if her husband or the kids were away, she constantly had to check in on them, call them obsessively, all that kind of thing happens. We started working with her, and we found out that the problems had really begun several months earlier when she actually had been sick, and she took 1 antibiotic, and this was a mom who did holistic stuff so much, but she took an antibiotic for an infection, kind of a, oh, you've got to take this antibiotic or you'll have a horrible infection. And so she did. And shortly thereafter, she actually developed some motor tics. And the onset of the anxiety actually began after that antibiotic for a sore throat. And then the tics happened. And then after a few weeks, it gave way to these severe fears and anxiety reactions. And the tics actually kind of settled down. And we often see that something physical that is related to PANDAS will manifest first, and then as the strep finds its way into the nervous system, then it starts moving over and affecting the emotions and the behaviors. So we get these fears and these anxiety reactions and OCD and so forth. In her case, it just was mostly just the checking was checking on husband and family. We started working with her, and actually within just a few days of starting on the remedies, her anxiety dropped significantly. All of a sudden, she started feeling actually functional again. And she has had some milder and sometimes shorter returns of the anxiety, but as soon as she can kind of pull herself out of it enough to go, oh, I need to take my remedies, the remedies knock it right out. And over the past several months, we have actually worked to clear her or detoxify her. We use the word clearing because it's a lot easier to slide out of our mouths. And started focusing on, you know, that she had had this drug and this sore throat. So we started actually treating her as if she had just taken the drug for the sore throat. And over time, and a few contributing factors, you know, just generally looking at her history, the things that were leading up to the original problem, but primarily it all started when she had a sore throat, which probably was strep related, and an antibiotic. So we focused on that time frame, and we could use homeopathic remedies to help detoxify her for these old pathogens and drugs and so forth, just to let the body let them out that had been actually creating the problem. And as we do these clearings, and it does take several times, each time the anxiety comes back for just a little while, and it's usually very mild, or if it does come back intensively, it lasts a few minutes to an hour or two. And each time it's a little shorter and a little less intense. And then for a longer period, she doesn't have the anxiety, or if it comes back, it's way, way, way milder. So she is well on her way to getting better. The next case is a case of PANDAS and autism together. A young boy, he was a teenager. He had actually worked with us for a number of years on autism and speech delay, and he'd had a lot of good gains. We had worked on his gut. His gut was healing. We had focused on the vaccine injury aspect. He was really, really doing well. And he had gained a good amount of speech. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't perfect conversational, but it was definitely improving. And he had developed some good life skills. He had been not toilet trained. And then all of a sudden, he developed severe fears about going through doorways. The threshold, he'd look down and he'd see that piece of wood or metal on the floor in the doorway, and he literally could not get past the doorway. Okay, Elizabeth, you are asking some fabulous questions, and I am going to answer those as I get through these. So go ahead and post them, and I definitely will address them when I get done. Because you bring up very valid points, and I want to talk about those. So I'm not ignoring you. So while we were working with this child, he suddenly developed these strange fears. He was having issues with doorways, and then all of a sudden he couldn't go. No, don't apologize, Elizabeth. You're fine. All of a sudden he couldn't walk through the bathroom door. Suddenly he started having accidents because he would get to the door of the bathroom and he couldn't go through it. He would pee on the floor because he couldn't hold it. Or if he could be coaxed into the bathroom, then he couldn't walk out without a whole lot of time and energy to coax him. And he'd have meltdowns and fears and things. So really, really very, very sad situation, especially in a child who had been perfectly toilet trained up until this time. So, of course, our first question is, what in the world happened to bring this on when he was moving forward beautifully? And after, you know, a lot of head scratching and so forth, the mom realized that strep was going around at school. So he had had that exposure. And even though with him, he didn't manifest the typical throat symptoms, he had actually, the mom went, oh my gosh, he did say that his ears had bothered him. And she gave him some homeopathic remedies for it. He had a little bit of a brief low-grade fever for a couple of days afterwards, but she didn't even give strep a thought. Well, strep can also manifest in the ears, the nose, and the throat, all of the above, which people really don't realize. And so, she didn't really give it a thought. It went away with a few remedies that she had on hand. I don't think she even brought it up with us. And then it was a couple of weeks after that his behavior started with the thresholds and all of that. So it took a little bit of time from the time he was exposed to go through the physical and then into the emotional and the emotional and behavioral side of it. And that's a real common pattern. You've already seen two of our cases that I've talked about here, and we've had a lot more than that. Once we put those pieces together, we were able to start working to help his body rebalance itself after the strep exposure. And within a few weeks, he actually started going through other doorways at first. And then about a week into that, the mom reported that he had gone to the bathroom by himself entirely for the first time in several months. He just got up and disappeared, and I think during a therapy session or something. And he walked into the bathroom and he did his business and he came back out it was just no big deal, like he'd been doing it all along. And after 3 or 4 months, he had really returned to no more episodes of the going through the doors, the stopping going through the doors, no more problems, and started just independently taking himself to and from the bathroom and everywhere else in the house. So we know that we can get the strep under control. Actually, this is a good point for me to say, can we get rid of this in control of it? I do know that we have worked with some 2 or 3 kids of my own in my particular practice that have had these problems come up on and off, and then they got better after we worked with them. But every September they'd go back to school, and some of their school buddies would have gotten some new vaccines to go into the new school year. And probably through the shedding, strep would start going around, and next thing we know, we would hear from the mom, and the child's tics would have returned, or their OCD had returned. And again, hang on. Okay, is the sound back? I bumped my computer. Okay, is the sound back? Okay, I bumped a cord on one of those precious cords on my computer, so my apologies. So, okay, after school started, 2 or 3 kids have come back around that have been fully recovered, but they get a new exposure, and yes, they went into tics or a little bit of OCD, and things seem to have straightened themselves out. So do we get rid of the strep 100%? Well, it is possible, but there are no good tests to know whether it's completely gone. We go by the symptoms. As long as the immune system is in control instead of the strep or whatever other pathogens may be involved, then we see that things are fine. We feel like the kids are making progress, but when they do get a re-exposure, it is possible for them that they simply are always going to be somewhat sensitive to strep. There's not a guarantee that we get rid of everything 100%, because our job is to get the immune system healthy enough and cut down the burdens enough that they aren't constantly fighting it. So now we have definitely seen things improve to the point where I would say 90% of our kids don't come back with these issues returning. So we know that we can get a handle on the immune system, and that's really the critical point, is are we getting a handle on what's going on with the child enough that we've unburdened the immune system and they can become functional. So we should be able to help just about everybody who has these problems. It sometimes takes a while. If the problems are deeply behavioral, where we have a lot of aggression, then some damage has happened in the nervous system. So it may take a little longer than with somebody who sees us shortly thereafter. But the body is very resilient, and it will rebalance itself, and nerve tissue can actually regenerate. So it may take a little longer if this happened sometime in the distant past, but we still have seen permanent results with a lot of kids. And most of the times when the kids don't get the permanent results, they're doing great, and it's another exposure, a new exposure that is creating the problem. So I want to talk about one more. This one is fairly near and dear to me. It was one of my young relatives, a 5-year-old with mild anxiety on and off, but otherwise very neurotypically developing. And just before starting into kindergarten, there were some jerks that would happen that would literally cause a head and shoulder throw backwards. And unfortunately, that was a safety issue, because at 5 years old, they're about even with a tabletop. And a couple of times, there were a couple of pretty good knots on the head that were a problem. The parents had some testing done and were told that there looked like there might have been some mild abnormal brain activity in a region that might indicate very mild seizures, but it wasn't definitive, and it really didn't fit the criteria for seizures. And just kind of as a side note, around age 2, when a number of vaccines were given, the child was put into glasses because there was a bit of a crossing of the eyes. So that isn't necessarily directly strep related. But I was called, obviously safety was a serious concern because of the potential for an injury. And so my first focus was to try to very quickly reduce the tics, both in intensity and in frequency. And it was also discovered that there were some very deep times of unexplained sadness and actually tearfulness that started around the same time. And so we started working in a very focused manner on what was going on with the child's tics. And within a matter of about 3 weeks, we talked, and it was like, oh my gosh, I've got a very different child on my hands. The tics had entirely disappeared from several times a day down to 1 or 2 in the whole 3-week period. And then after we did our first set of cleansing rounds, the child was completely different. No tics. The tantrums, which we really hadn't focused on, had settled down. The zoning out, which was one of the concerns about whether or not there might be absence type seizures, had really cut down. There was a whole lot more conversational talk. She started telling stories and just became a lot more outgoing and more engaged with the family, where before, if a lot of people were around, they had friends over, a lot of times she'd just sort of withdraw to her room or maybe go build a tent under the dining room table. So a lot of changes very quickly. And the cool thing was we had some other surprising things as we started working back through the vaccine history and all of those sorts of things. Her eyes actually started becoming more correctly focused and aimed, so less crossing of the eyes. The emotions have been way more even and much more appropriate to the situations. We started seeing improvements in small motor coordination. Suddenly she could color inside the lines. She could start, she's in kindergarten, so starting to trace letters and numbers became much easier and much neater. And there has not been a recurrence of a tic in the last 9 months. I went back over it before I did this and over my notes. And the last actual, that head throw, shoulder throw tic has not happened at all in the past 9 months. The extended family has noticed a much calmer, more engaged, less sensitive to noise and chaos child who's just really been involved. So our method is what we used with all of these people. And sometimes we can know what it was that caused it. It's either in the history. Other times we don't know when it came on. We don't know specifically what remedy we used that perhaps addressed what, because we may have to clear a lot of things together that happen together because we go event by event. We use a lot of different types of homeopathy in our method. We use German biological medicines that can help with just supporting the body to reduce not only the symptoms, but reduce the pathogenic load. We use pretty much everything in all of homeopathy, a lot of different sub-methods in homeopathy. But the biggest issue is every person is unique. So we don't necessarily have to know exactly what caused something. It can be a vaccine. It can be strep. It can be strep from a vaccine. It can be an entirely different pathogen. It can be seizures or tic disorders after a DTaP. It really doesn't matter whether we know the specifics or not, but the more we know, the easier it is for us to get that more permanent response. But we also are able to help no matter what is going on with the child. We just need a good history, and we need to know what exactly it is that is going on with the child. And our link has disappeared, and I am not even going to go there. I'm going to ask your indulgence for just a moment while I bring up a link. Hang on. Unfortunately, I lost my link when I had to unhook everything and start over, but I will give you a link in one moment where if you feel like like this might be a good fit for you, we will happily offer you a little bit of our time to just talk about whether or not it's appropriate for you. We have worked with literally thousands of people over the years. We have helped thousands of people. As I said, we have had over almost 200 kids, over 195 kids who have completely recovered from autism. We have had so many other people who have recovered from various aspects such as gut disorders. All right, I am putting up the form link now. We have worked with gut disorders. We have worked with so many different health issues. Like I said, everything from autism to hangnails and everything in between. We really, really do work with just about everything under the sun, but our focus has indeed been, for the past several years, we know that we can help just about everything in the PANDAS realm and the homeopathy realm for autism. We have had kids fully recover from gut disorders. We've had adults who have recovered from PANDAS type aspects, which it's not really PANDAS because the first word of PANDAS is pediatric, but we've seen exactly the same symptoms in teenagers, young adults, older adults, and it actually will help. Hangnails are where you have skin hanging around your nail. It's just a euphemism for a very minor health problem. So we can help with minor things, acute things such as, flu and cold symptoms, or, eczema. Literally any health problem homeopathy can help with. But PANDAS is becoming such a huge issue, and we want to get the word out there that there is hope. There is hope for PANDAS. There is hope for autism. There is hope for PANDAS and autism together. There is hope for virtually any kind of health problem. Now, I also promised you some quick tips here. Some things that you can do before you ever call us or are ever interested in working with us or doing homeopathy. These are things that we have found if somebody has a lot of anxiety, or they have a lot of irritability, or they have, in the case of kids with autism, if they have aggression, all of these things can actually be made worse by certain things in the diet. And I want people to become aware that there is a strain of strep called Streptococcus thermophilus. It is seen by the probiotic world as something at the very least benign, if not beneficial. But if someone is very high in strep, and especially if it is in their nervous system, they need to avoid anything that contains Streptococcus thermophilus, which means it's actually listed on the label of some probiotics. So it is a part of the of many, many probiotics. So you want to read the label, and you do not want to have somebody with PANDAS taking a probiotic that contains Streptococcus thermophilus. It's sometimes abbreviated S-therm or strep therm. It's also found in all commercially produced yogurt or kefir. If you can see the screen, strep thermophilus is on the screen. Strepthermophilus. It's found in yogurt, it's found in kefir, and it's found in probiotics. Now, not all probiotics have them. Our probiotics have been vetted to not have strep thermophilus. The other thing you want to avoid is any kind of an excitotoxin, which are chemicals that are often found in, unfortunately, a lot of our foods. MSG, or monosodium glutamate. Glutathione is another thing that you want to avoid, and glutamate. Anything that has glutamic acid, you want to avoid these things. Glutathione is often used in the treatment of autism, but L-glutamine is also an amino acid. It can help with sugar cravings, but in our kids who have high levels of strep, they can sometimes convert glutamates in other forms, like L-glutamine, into glutamate, and they can actually become very, very aggressive, angry, that kind of thing. And of course, artificial colors, flavors, and preservatives, and GMOs, I would add, also they're bad for everybody, so they should be avoided. But in the case of high strep, it can be a problem. So you don't want to have these in the system. They can increase anxiety, aggression. They can actually cause ear infections and throat infections to become chronic. So they're just generally a good thing to avoid. So, all right, I'm going to throw things open now for the Q&A. Okay, give me just a minute. I want to go back and answer some of the questions. All right, autoimmunity is autoimmunity is basically the medical world's catch-all term for anything that involves inflammation and streptococcus in the system. Now, I need to make it clear, we don't diagnose strep. We don't diagnose any of this. We use homeopathic literature to analyze what's going on. And a lot of times that points to strep, but what we are focusing on is homeopathic remedies that will address a lot of the symptoms that do seem to be very much wound up in streptococcus. And strep does make everything in the body become inflamed. If there is any inflammation in the body and strep is present, it will make it all worse. So as we chisel away at all of the things that can cause an inflammation in the brain or in the nervous system, we are going to find that there are other issues that are going to get better. So as we address whether it's strep that's causing the problem or whether it is some other pathogen, whether it's heavy metals, as things begin to be chiseled away, you're going to see inflammation cut down. And when inflammation cuts down, everything is going to get better. Okay, there were some questions about, are there tests for pandas? We do not do any testing, so that is honestly not a realm that we get into. I understand there is a panel of tests that are referred to, I believe, as the Cunningham panel of tests, but they're a series of blood tests. And the honest truth is blood tests and testing are a snapshot. So we don't ask for tests. We go by what are the symptoms? Are they chronic? Are they recent? When did they come on? What are the factors that happened ahead of time? So are there definitive tests for pandas? The medical world would say, oh, we have one. And when it's a false negative, then they say unequivocally, no, you don't have strep or you don't have pandas. Well, I'm here to tell you I've worked with a lot of people who tested negative for strep or negative for pandas with their doctors, and they've come to us and we've been able to help. So very definitely, there are tests out there. You can spend a lot of money testing, but a test can have a false negative or a false positive depending on what's happening in the immune system at the time of the test. We had a question about, is there a specific time frame where we can or cannot help? There really is no age limit. With homeopathy, we have kids, we've had full-blown autistic, aggressive kids come to us as old as 27 or as young as 18 months. Age is simply not a factor as far as can we help. It is a little bit of a factor as far as how long it may take to see the results, because the older we are, the slower the metabolism is. So, an older child, we can't clear quite as quickly as a younger child. A little more damage may have been done in the system, so it takes a little longer once we get the cleaning up done for the healing to begin to show itself. But there's really not a limitation. It's just a matter of, it takes a little more patience with older kids or, young adults or even older adults. things just go a little more slowly sometimes because of the speed of metabolism and because the timeline, the history, the chronological history is a little longer. So it takes us longer to get back to those more permanent gains because we have to move through what brought them on in order to get the permanence. Okay, can vaccine injury cause strep issues? Well, vaccine injury is going to be a burden on the immune system. The PCV vaccines in particular do contain strep. Other vaccines can actually, if they come in multi-dose vials, it is entirely possible for other vaccines to be contaminated with strep or with staph or any number of other bacterial issues, because if perfect sterile technique isn't followed, it's very easy for that little rubber thing that they put the needle through to get contaminated. And then that gets carried into the vial, and the vial sits on the shelf, and then it becomes basically a petri dish for bacterial growth. So I will say that a lot of vaccines, we've had kids whose parents observed that their child got a vaccine from one of the multi-dose vials, and either they got more of the preservative because it wasn't shaken up well every time that multi-dose vial was used, so they got a lot more mercury in their system and they tumbled after that. Or it could be that strep contamination was in it. You really want a fresh vial. If your doctor or your nurse walks out and you're still vaccinating, then you don't want the bottom of the barrel, because it will be definitely a good possibility that there is more mercury, there is more chance for contaminants. So yeah, any vaccine is coming in around, doing an end run around the immune system. Our bodies were designed to be exposed to illness through the nose, the mouth, the eyes, inhaled, and very definitely, you know, our immune systems were designed to handle that. And there are definitely some issues about vaccines bringing in, whether it's a contaminant or whether it's the PCV, which is pneumococcus vaccine, which is actually now a streptococcus pneumoniae vaccine. All of these things can bring in problems that can lead to OCD, anxiety, sore throats, earaches, all of these sorts of things. So, you know, a lot of issues like that are often taken care of. It can be improved through avoiding some of the things we talked about, but we have seen that we honestly do not have to know absolutely where it came in to be able to help with these things. It's very helpful for us, and we do, we're pretty insistent that we have a chronological health and emotional trauma, physical trauma timeline. We get a vaccine record, because all of these factors are going to be contributors to what's going on in the here and now that makes people sick. So we're pretty thorough in what we do. We have some great results with a lot of people, and we enjoy what we do because we have a heart for it as parents of kids who were hurt ourselves. And fortunately, a number of us are also parents of recovered kids using our system. So, okay, one last question here. Can you help reverse brain injury? It is going to depend on what that injury is. We have worked with people with traumatic brain injuries from botched forceps birth, and that can definitely be a limiting factor. But where things are happening because of the presence of some pathogen or some inflammation of the brain, the blood-brain barrier is not a barrier to homeopathy. So we've had kids who were diagnosed with all kinds of brain inflammation and brain injuries, and they definitely can improve. We've even had children who have had oxygen deprivation who have recovered. So there are a lot of things that we have helped with in the past and we will continue to help with in the future. We really enjoy what we do. We get good results, and we're here because of kids. We know that kids are being hurt every day, and we are here to help. So I'm putting up that link if you would like to speak with us. We do have a limitation of our schedules, but I have put up the link again. And if you are interested in speaking with us briefly, of course, you can also call our office at any time. And I'm going to put that up so that you can call our office. Our office manager is very, very knowledgeable and can answer a lot of general questions. And the link that I put up is just an inquiry form. It gives us some very, very basic information, not even really a lot of help about, you know, your child's situation, but just gives us an idea of where your child or where you are. And then we can talk about whether or not we think we can help you or your child and go from there, see if it's a good fit on both sides. So I'm going to wrap things up now. I've taken up almost an hour of your day, but a number of you have hung in there, and we will be sending out a replay link for this. So I hope that you will check out our website. If you've got questions, by all means, call our office. You can click the link, and thank you again for joining us.